Um, Good evening, everybody. Today, University of the West actually is formally welcoming our guest of honor, especially to this University of the West Pali Society. We have started this Pali Society as a brand new student club, but I thought club would be, really not suitable for us. In parallel to something like Polytech Society, which is of course a highly recognized society. So we thought of giving credit to this university. So keeping in touch with the identity of the university. So I thought of having this UWest Pali Society, through which we have, of course, a very budding student society here, and we are, of course, moving forward, and we meet twice a week, and we do have a lot of programs in hand. I'm very happy to see our guest of honor today, because just a couple of months or so we are in the campus and with the society activity, and hopefully his glorious presence here will definitely be a royal boost for all of us. So I thank you so very much on behalf of the University of the West, UWest Pali Society. Let me most respectfully welcome our Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. Everyone knows him, so we don't need much of an introduction to him. Still, I would like to read out some of the objectives that we have lined up for us in our University of the West Pali Society. UWest Pali Society is committed to promote Theravada Pali tradition, both academically and ritually. We welcome all the US community members to join us and feel good with us. We do have a Facebook page and also a Google Plus page, so we are sharing our updates with weekly basis. We update, and we share a lot of things with our members. It's a closed group, so if somebody wants to join, you can send us a request. We can approve. So we do have here Pali Sutta reading, because that's one of the objectives of forming this university society. So Pali Sutta reading, here we read selected originally Pali Suttas in English and discuss the key Pali terms leading to further discussions. We invite all those like-minded people to join us, and we are ready to help anyone who has difficulties in understanding English. We do have a kind of unity in diversity, lots of people from various ESA backgrounds, so we would like to help others also if they have some difficulty. Well, the other thing is the introductory Pali learning. We have already started this thing. We introduce Pali, not the academic, highly academic level, of course, to those who are new to Pali, who are interested in learning Pali. We are ready to help them. We have already started teaching Pali alphabet and some of those basic sensas. And guest speakers, this one is the first. So it's going to be a very great auspicious start for us. So thank you so very much, Venerable sir. I met him just a few weeks ago in Berkeley when we were chanting, the first ever Tipitaka chanting ceremony in US. So I was so fortunate to be a part of that, and Venerable was there, and his presence was very highly felt because we were chanting together for all the 3 days in Berkeley. So I was very happy to meet him, and we just talked about our society, and he said, "Oh, I'm going to come here." So today I thought, yeah, why not we invite him to talk to our members also. So today it happened. Thank you so much for coming here. And chanting service, we will, our committed members are willing to participate. Any ceremony at the university, US premises, where Pali Sutta chanting is required. We do have another society, what we call the Dhamma Club, and also they are doing a very great job. We have chaplain programs. Lots of people are, Theravada tradition, people are doing some work. So we are not, of course, we are kind of integrating with them. We are mutually, helping each other, sharing and sharing for each other, our university community, and also we like to reach the outside as well. So blessing the newborn babies, blessing the newly married couples, blessing the newly built homes, blessing the sick and the old people, and attending funeral occasions. It depends on, necessary. So we would like to, our people will go and bless for them. So with these objectives, we actually started the UWest Pali Society, and hope we can mold and build up on that basis and reach for much more diverse objectives later on. So today, while welcoming our guest of honor, Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, let me introduce him formally, although I know it's not really necessary because his name is very well known all over the world. Bhikkhu Bodhi is an American Buddhist monk from New York City, born in Brooklyn, New York in 1944. He obtained a BA in philosophy from Brooklyn College 1966 and a PhD in philosophy from Claremont Graduate School 1972. Drawn to Buddhism in his early 20s, after completing his university studies, he traveled to Sri Lanka, where he received novice ordination in 1972 and full ordination in 1973. Both under the late Venerable Ananda Maitreya, the leading Sri Lankan scholar, monk of recent time. I heard he has stayed in Sri Lanka for 24 years. He was appointed editor of the Buddhist Publication Society in Sri Lanka, which we call BPS, in 1984, and is president in 1988. Venerable Bodhi has many important publications to his credit, either as author, translator, or editor, including the Buddha translation of the Majjhima Nikaya, co-translated with Venerable Bhikkhu Nyanamuli, 1995. The Connected Discourses of the Buddha, a new translation of the Samyutta Nikaya 2000, and in the Buddha's words 2005. In May 2000, he gave the keynote address at the United Nations on its first official celebration of Vesak, the day of the Buddha's birth, enlightenment, and passing away. He returned to the US in 2002. He currently resides at Chuang Yang Monastery and teaches there and at Bodhi Monastery. He is currently the chairman of Jingshon.
No, that's old.
I'm so sorry for that. So, of course, there can be a lot of updates. So,
that's from, I don't know, a few years ago, I think.
Okay, with these words, I on behalf of our University of UWest Pali Society members, I most respectfully welcome Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. You can start.
I told Venerable Sumita that I wouldn't give a lecture because I'm supposed to give a lecture tomorrow.
Yeah.
I gave one lecture in the Dharma Vijaya
Temple, yeah.
Dharma Vijaya Vihara on the Saturday night? Saturday evening.
Yeah.
And then tomorrow I'm giving a talk here. But maybe I'll just say a few words about the importance of studying Pali. Is it better I stand up because then people in the back won't be able to see this.
It's fun, verbal,
But
maybe
What?
Be comfortable, it's fine.
No, this budding movie star who now has his name in flashing lights on the front entrance.
Yeah, exactly, yeah, that's right. We think with
Receptacles, Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, that is followed by a flashing in days of death. I was thinking it should say Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi and Bridget Bardot in days of death.
No.
Oh, dear. I can picture that. I wouldn't have went with that.
Okay, so the special importance of Pali is that Pali is the language in which the single, complete compilation of texts from the early period of Buddhism is preserved. Okay, now in the Theravada tradition, it's believed or often said that Pali is the language that the Buddha himself used. According to modern scholars, that's very, very improbable, almost to the point we could discount it. But it doesn't mean that the Pali language is significantly different from the language that the Buddha used, because the languages that were used in North India all belong to a single family of languages, which they call
Great. Yeah, don't knock the flower down.
Oh, be careful.
Yes, yes. That's fine.
It should be okay. It's just going to graze the petals and the edge. You can hold it to us.
You know, I didn't prepare for this as a lecture, so all of the dates and figures and details I didn't, review and jot down. But the oldest Indian language for which we have record is the language of the texts that are called the Vedas. And so they call the language in which the Vedas are preserved Vedic Sanskrit, which is somewhat different from classical Sanskrit. And I'm not a Sanskritist, and I believe we have an accomplished Sanskritist here. And so I think the Vedas maybe go back to at least the oldest portions, perhaps as old as 1500 BC. Then there would be a long period of the evolution of the language and branching out into various forms of what are called Prakrits. The Prakrits would be spoken languages. The difference, the word Sanskrit means polished or refined, and Prakrit means original or natural. And so these would be more the spoken languages. And by the time we come to a period like the 500 BC, 600 BC, and we have a whole group of languages which are called Middle Indo-Aryan languages. And exactly which language the Buddha used, it's completely uncertain, completely undetermined. But my supposition would be that the Buddha traveled over a wide territory in northeastern India, and probably each territory had its own distinctive dialect. So when the Buddha, the two major states of that region, in somewhat to the southeast was the state of Magadha, which later became the center of the First Indian Empire. In the Buddha's time, Magadha now corresponds largely to present-day Bihar, the state of Bihar. So we have Magadha somewhat over here. And up here we have the state. Again, I'm not a specialist in geography, but so we have Magadha here. And then here there was the other powerful state of the period, which is the state of Kosala. And so the Buddha had several main monasteries, and Magadha, his main monastery, is what they call the Bamboo Grove. Veluvana, the Bamboo Grove. And then in Kosala, of course, he had Jetavana, Jeta's Grove, the monastery established by the wealthy householder Anathapindika. Also, from time to time, he would go to dwell in called the mansion of Megara's mother. Megara's mother's mansion. And so my supposition would be that when he was in Magadha, he would use the dialect distinctive of Magadha. When he, perhaps Kosala probably had his own dialect. So when he was in Kosala, he would have used Kosalan. If he traveled, sometimes it seems he traveled even further to the east, maybe even to regions which now would be included in present-day Bengal, Indian Bengal. He might have used an ancient form of Bengali. And then some of the suttas are ascribed to an area which is now corresponds to Delhi. This would be the Kuru, it's called the Kuru country. Maybe they had their own dialect. But all of these, though we speak about these as different languages, but they're all very similar. So if you know one of these dialects, you would be able to understand the other dialects. And then Pali is held to be, this is by opinion of philologists like K.R. Norman and Oscar von Hinuber. K.R. Norman, of course, is a British scholar, formerly the president of the Pali Text Society, now he's retired. And von Hinuber is professor in a university in Germany, I think it's Freiburg. Anyway, according to their theory, you see Pali exhibits some features of Western Indian languages. And so the hypothesis presented by the modern scholars is that Pali is something of a syncretic language, that is a language which combines features of the East Indian dialects with features of the West Indian dialects in order to make the Buddhist text comprehensible to monks who are living over a wide range of territory in northern India. So we have like the western provinces. Maybe these would be like Avanti. And maybe further south. Yeah, the place where Sanchi is located. I don't know what state that is now. What state? Bhopal. Bhopal is close by. But what is the name of the state? Is it part of Maharashtra? Or maybe Madhya Pradesh? Actually, I think it's probably Madhya Pradesh. Okay, so the Pali language combines features of Eastern dialects and the Western dialects combined. The philologists like Norman and von Hinuber analyze what these features are. Okay, but probably it's quite possible that the text of early Buddhism had been preserved in a number of dialects of India, but as Buddhism as time went on, Sanskrit, classical Sanskrit, came into favor. Perhaps this was in the 3rd century, maybe after the time of King Ashoka. Then Vedic Sanskrit was had evolved over several centuries, and then the laws of Sanskrit, the rules, were formalized by a number of grammarians like Panini and Patanjali. And so then we get what is called classical Sanskrit. And now, because classical Sanskrit became the language of the intelligentsia and the cultural elite in India, the Buddhists who were preserving the Buddhist text and some of the other schools felt that it was necessary to sort of bring their collections of scriptures, which were now preserved in older dialects, which were not well understood, so to bring them up to par by subjecting them to a process of Sanskritization. So in a somewhat earlier phase, we get a language with many variations, which is called Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit. So we sort of like filter the Buddhist text through classical Sanskrit, or where we mix a little classical Sanskrit with the old Buddhist language of the Buddhist text. And we get the language which is abbreviated BHS, Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit. And we see this Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit even in like 2 stages of it in a work that belonged to a school called, or one of the branches of the Mahasangika school, and that work is called the Mahavastu. Mahavastu, it's the great story. So this is the story about the future Buddha Gautama's past lives as a bodhisattva, incorporates a lot of Jataka type material, then it continues up to his last life as Siddhartha Gautama, who would be Gautama, Siddhartha Gautama, then his quest for enlightenment, his enlightenment, and the early period of the teaching. And scholars distinguish in the Mahavastu 2 layers of Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit. The older layer is what they sometimes call layer A, which is sort of based on more archaic material, which has parallels in the Pali Suttas, so it's like a reworking of sutta material in terms of Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit. Then the other strata, the later strata of Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit is called layer B, which is a somewhat more ornate, fancy, embellished language. And then what happened to the scriptures of some of the other schools is that they were subjected to a much more thorough process of Sanskritization. And even though whole collections didn't survive, but researchers and explorers have unearthed in the sands of Central Asia, they've unearthed caves and sometimes just ruins of old monasteries in which they found fragments of text preserved from some of the other schools, texts that correspond to the text in the Pali canon. So these are not Mahayana texts, but they're texts from the stage of early Buddhism, but had been preserved in a Sanskrit conforming more closely to the standards of classical Sanskrit, though still with some Buddhist features, with some features of the older language preserved. And even the Pali suttas have undergone to some extent, lightly, a process of Sanskritization. This is according to, these philological scholars. For example, very simple example, in Buddhist hybrid, in the Pali canon, we come across a derivation of the word Brahmin. So what is a Brahmana? And so the Buddha explains this with a kind of word play. I think it goes, again, I didn't prepare, so I have to work from memory. So it goes something like, if somebody knows exactly what it is, you could correct me. Could it be?
It's also called Bahita Papa Brahman, right? Samita Papa.
Oh, that's better. Right, that's actually better. Maybe that's the way the commentaries explain it. Again, Bahita Papa.
Bahita Papa Brahman, Samita Papa Sama.
Okay, Bahita
Papa.
Papa
Yes.
Brahmana. You find this derivation, Majjhima Nikaya, let's see. I think it would be Sutta number 39 in the Majjhima Nikaya. Towards the end, the Buddha gives an explanation of many Brahminic terms with playful derivations. But my point here is that you see, if we take the word Brahmana, it's difficult to see the relation of that, how this is a word play on the word Bahita. Or is it Bahita? Or with the long A?
Yeah.
With the long A, okay. But so the conjecture is that in the older Pali language that the Buddha, or the language that the Buddha himself would have used, the word would have been Bhamana. And so here you could see a wordplay between Bhamana and Bahita. So why is somebody called a Brahmin? So Bahita means having expelled or done away with papa, evil. So because one has done away with evil, therefore one is called Bhamana. But if we have the word Brahmana, we can't see that derivation so clearly. But with Bhamana, the wordplay comes out. But probably by the 3rd century BC, people wouldn't have understood the word Bhamana. It would have seemed like a strange, archaic word, especially because the influence of the Brahmins had increased so much, and everybody was calling them Brahmanas. And so to make the Pali text meaningful, the older word Bhamana would have been Sanskritized to Brahmana. And then some scholars have pointed out, the word for the absolutive for having seen. Oh yeah, this is the absolutive ending.
Gerund.
Yeah, also it's called a gerund or absolutive. Comes out like this. Like, for example, having cooked. Hachipa. Having gone. Gunpa. Having behaved or acted, Charipa. Okay, so there's some conjecture that in the, you see here we have a combination of two consonants. I hope I'm not driving away and that the next time you have a meeting of the Pali Society, you'll get 4 or 5 people left. Oh my, this is too boring and too detailed. But you see, here we have a combination of consonants. And it's said that in the older form of the Indo-Aryan language, a combination of different consonants you wouldn't have found. So the speculation is that in the older form of the Indo-Aryan language, you would have had something like either Pachita or with double T, Pachita. But then with the influence of Sanskrit, these types of forms then got changed to conform to the Sanskrit model, which uses, to indicate the gerund or absolutive, uses the ending TVA. So then we have Pachipa, Charipa, Ganpa. Okay, so this indicates that even Pali that has come down to us has undergone some, even the Pali of the suttas has undergone some process of Sanskritization. And then when you get to the Pali of the commentaries and the sub-commentaries, which if you're patient enough and study diligently, someday you may get to, you can see that even the style is often like that of a classical Sanskrit commentary. Again, I don't want to frighten you away. But they use long, complex sentences which are sort of strung together by connecting phrases with indirect noun forms and gerunds following upon gerund upon gerund. Okay, but again, coming back to my theme, is that the importance of the Pali canon, I say that there are 3 special importance, 3 reasons why it's especially important. One is that it is the one collection from the early Buddhist period of early Buddhism that has come down to us as a whole in an Indian language. Now we have translations of texts from early Buddhism, texts that have been translated into Chinese, so we have the Chinese Agamas, or Ahangjing, and some of the texts have been translated into Tibetan, so we have some of these texts in the Kanjur, is it the Kanjur, of the Tibetan canon. But these are languages which are very, very different from any of the Indian languages. And so the Pali canon, even though Pali might not be exactly the language that the Buddha himself used, but a combination of various dialects, but the vocabulary would be similar to the language that the languages that the Buddha used. The grammar would be similar. The idioms would be similar. And so it's probably the closest we can get to a collection of texts that is in a language closely related to the language or languages that the Buddha himself used. Okay, so one reason is because it is, again, it's a language related to the language that the Buddha himself, language or languages that the Buddha himself used. And one thing about languages, very interesting thing, is that languages often use words with rather sophisticated meanings, and yet these meanings often stem from underlying metaphors relating to concrete experiences. To give you an example of this, of a word very important in Buddhism, Okay, we have the word sankhara, which is the same as like Sanskrit samskar. Okay, and this word is used among it has various meanings. One meaning would be like all conditioned things, like we have sabbe sankhara anicca. All conditioned things are impermanent. And then also we have in the formula for dependent origination, one has we have avijja paccaya sankhara, sankhara paccaya vijnana. Okay, so we have this word sankhara, and now the word is being used, with philosophical meaning. So one sense is all conditioned things, everything which arises from a combination of causes and conditions. And then in dependent origination, it's those things taken to be volitional factors which arise from ignorance and bring in consciousness, vijnana, into being. Okay, so the word is used with several philosophical nuances, but underlying this is a kind of metaphor which becomes clear if one breaks the word up into its prefix and the verb. The verb is the verb karoti. So the verb karoti means to make, to do or to make, and the prefix sang usually gives a suggestion of together. So sankhara becomes, if we look into the metaphorical meaning of the word, it means something like making together. And so it comes to signify those things that are made that are put together by a combination of causes and conditions, and also volitional activities, acts of intention, which put together other things, which are especially the things that make up the five aggregates, but especially consciousness. Now, if we're translating this into Chinese, we get what character? Usually, is this correct?
Yep.
So xing often has the sense of, the original sense I think is walking, right?
Going forward.
Action.
Yeah, moving forward. And so, bad calligraphy.
Good place.
So in the Chinese, you don't get the sense of putting together that you would get from the Sanskrit, but a different kind of metaphorical sense is being used here, especially with, I think, it's basing on the meaning of sankhara as activity. So you're having a word with the metaphorical sense of walking, or moving, going forward, being used to represent a word that in Indian language suggests rather the sense of putting together, acting together. So to get a kind of deep understanding of the interconnection of words, when you look into the root metaphors in the original language, then you can get a sense of the particular flavor that was being imparted to the word, especially as the Buddha chose these words in expounding his teaching. Let me see if I can find another interesting metaphor. Okay, let's take maybe a word, upadana. Okay, the word upadana we have from dana, which is based on the verb deti, to give. So dana is giving. And when you put the prefix a in front of it, you have adana, which is the opposite of giving, taking. And then upa usually suggests close to oneself. So the metaphor here is taking and bringing close to oneself. And so that gives us upadana, which we usually translate as grasping, clinging, or attachment. But the sense here is taking hold of and bringing close to oneself. And so when you see upadana, then you can see that it has somewhat of almost the opposite meaning of the word dana, which is giving. But if one is working with translations into other languages, then you lose the underlying connection of these metaphors. And even if you take a word like nibbana, so we have here the idea of the original sense of va is, I think it's relating to going out or cooling, and then it has the prefix near plus va, and then n, so you get nirvana, is the going out of a fire. That's the original metaphorical sense. And what happens with Pali when R and V meet, the combination of R and V is not stable in Pali, so it turns into a double V. So we get nibbana, which has, underlying this is sort of the metaphorical sense of the going out of a fire. This is the fire, sometimes explained as the fire of, or the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion. But, if you read the Chinese text, they don't even translate it. Well, they do the same thing that we do in English. In English, we just say nibbana, or if one is translating from Sanskrit, nirvana. So the Chinese just say nibbana. Okay, so one special value of the Pali Canon is that it's preserved in an Indian language which carries through the interconnected web of metaphors that underlie the language, which would have been the metaphors, the metaphorical senses that the Buddha himself was aware of in the use of his terminology. Then another important contribution, or another important factor that makes the Pali Canon especially important is that it brings together a complete collection in one language. I should say, a complete collection coming from one school. That is the school that we now call the Theravada school. Now, the Chinese have translations of the four agamas corresponding to the four Nikayas, but for some reason the Chinese translators chose a different agama, when they chose the four agamas, they chose each agama coming from a different school. So we have the Dirgha Agama, that's the long collection, coming from the school called the Dharmaguptaka school, which flourished in the northwest, what is now would be Pakistan, eastern Afghanistan, because that particular region was close to the Silk Roads going from the northwest through Central Asia to China. So we have the Dirghagama coming from the Dharmakuptaka school, the Madhyama Agama, which counterpart of the Majjhima Nikaya, coming from, I think they ascribe it to a branch of the Sarvastivada school, the Sangyupta Agama coming from maybe the Mula Sarvastivada school, and the Ekottara Agama, the counterpart of the Anguttara Nikaya. I think the school identity is not known definitely, but usually they speculate it might have been a branch of the Mahasangika school. So we have 4 agamas in the Chinese translation, but each belonging to a different school. But the Pali collection, especially of the 4 and 5 Nikayas, all comes from one school. So there's a certain consistency of expression and uniformity of thought running through the entire collection. So that's another special value of the Pali Canon. Then the third special value of the Pali Canon is that it's a school which is the basis, or it's a collection which is the basis for a living school of Buddhism, which is the school that flourishes in Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, with pockets in Vietnam, pockets in Nepal and Bangladesh. Whereas, the Chinese agamas, you get like these complete collections, but do we have any Dharmakuptaka, any country following Dharmakuptaka Buddhism? No. Where are the Sarvastivadins? Maybe we could try a revival.
I don't think so.
Maybe is the rumor true that there's a Mula Sarvastivada monastery opening up in Iowa? And Mahasangikas are setting up a temple in Georgia? No, those are schools that defunct.
The Tibetans do practice Mula Sarvastivada.
They have the Vinaya, and the Chinese have the Dharmakuptaka Vinaya, but the schools themselves, each school had its own collection of sutras, probably their own Vinaya, their own Abhidharma Vitaka, but in that respect the school is gone. But the Vinaya of Dharmakuptaka was transmitted to China, then to Korea and Vietnam, and the Mula Sarvastivada went northwards to Tibet and the Himalayan countries. Okay, so I think maybe I said that I would just speak a few words.
This is great, Venerable. Thank you.
But we can open it up if you have some questions or corrections. Because I said I didn't really prepare, or any comments.
Yeah, I would like to ask, there's 2 Ardha Magadhi and Magadhi, right?
Yeah.
Can you tell the difference with those dialects?
Again, I'm not a philologist, but what's called Ardha Magadhi means half Magadha. So this is a language which is closely related to Magadhi, but it has some differences in spelling. I haven't investigated this issue, but the Ardha Magadha was used as the language for preserving the old scriptures of Jainism. I think the Jain commentaries were probably done in Sanskrit.
Prakrit.
They were done in the Prakrit.
Yeah, Prakrit. All
Yeah, but I think the oldest scriptures of Jainism were done in Ardha Magadhi. And now some of the features, now the way that we can tell that Magadhi is not exactly the same as the language of what we call Pali. We don't have any examples of Magadhi from the time of the Buddha himself, say the 5th century BC. But we do have some specimens of Magadhi from about maybe 150 years later, which we find in the form of the edicts of King Ashoka. And so from King Ashoka's edicts, we can determine what was the Magadhi used in that period. And it has some differences from Pali in that, again, please, if there are any real linguists here, correct me if I'm wrong. I remember K.R. Norman mentioned 3 points. And from this, you'll see that they're quite minor. Okay, so we'll call this King Ashoka's Magadhi, and this Pali. Okay, so the Magadhi of King Ashoka has, well, let's put it this way, in Pali, we have a clear distinction between these two, they call these semi-vowels, R and L. Where I think in King Ashoka's Magadhi, often we don't have the R, but the L occurs where one would expect an R in Pali. So for example, often we have a prefix pari, like maybe say pari nibbana. And I think in old Magadhi, if the word, I'm not sure if this word occurs, but the form we would expect would be maybe Pali Nibbana. I think it would be the L with the dot under it, the retroflex. But maybe not, I'm not sure actually. Okay, another difference is that in Pali, you see in Sanskrit we have 3 sibilants. The sibilant is the S sound. So we have the S, which is represented like this, like this. This is pronounced sh, sort of with the tongue against the roof of the mouth. And we have that's called the cerebral. I'm saying this is called not the cerebral, palatal, the palatal S. Then we have the cerebral or retroflex, which is represented in Roman script with the S with the dot under it. This is pronounced like the SH and she. And then we have the normal S without it, in Roman script without any diacritic. So this is like the S in, can't think of the word S. C, like to C. Okay, I think, so in Pali, all of the sibilants are represented by this S. Whereas I think in Magadhi, all of them are represented this way. So I've heard when a monk from Sri Lanka giving the precepts to a group of people from Bengal, Bengali Buddhists or Bangladeshi Buddhists, so the Sri Lankan monk will say, Buddhang Saranang Gacchami. And then I've heard the Bangladeshi people go, Buddhang Sharanang Gacchami. Because in the Bengali language, the S is pronounced sh also, because it's an Eastern language. And then I think the third difference is that in Pali, the nominative singular, masculine nominative singular, or at least in a large class of nouns, ends in O, like Buddho, Dhammo, whereas in Magadhi, the nominative singular ends of a large class of nouns, the masculine nouns, ends in A. the letter E, but it's pronounced like A, like it would be Buddhe, Dhamme, not here the locative, like in Pali, but in the nominative role. Okay, let's.
I'm wondering, as you were learning Pali and you got to the point where you were able to read and understand Pali directly without translating it into English in your head.
I think I still always translate it into English in my head.
Right? Okay.
I think so. I'm not so sure what goes on.
But I guess my question was, like you're speaking about the flavor of Pali, so I'm just wondering, as you started to learn it, what about the flavor of it struck you?
Well, maybe the word flavor has different senses.
Mm-hmm.
One is the flavor of the sound quality,
Mm-hmm.
which is very pleasant, especially when the way it's pronounced by either the Sri Lankan monks or Indian monks. Those who use I should say Sri Lankans or Indians, it doesn't matter whether monks, lay people, monks, nuns, lay people, but when they pronounce it with a language which is derived from Indian languages, so that the sound values are the same, then it has a very, let's say, very beautiful melodic flavor in that sense. Whereas with the Thais, it seems that the Pali language then gets refracted through their own language, so it comes out in a sharper rhythmic. And then with Burmese, the sounds of a number of letters get transformed according to the Burmese language. So I've heard Burmese Buddhists go, are you Burmese?
No.
Yeah, I'm safe, I won't get any. I won't get beaten up in the.
The pronunciation of Burmese is very different from.
Yeah, very different. So they go Budang Serinang Kisami, Budang Taranang Kisami, Tamang Taranang Kisami. I remember my many years ago when I went from Sri Lanka to India to make a tour of the sacred places, and we stopped at there was a Burmese temple at Kusinara, and so myself and an Indian monk who was my friend, we stayed there for the night, and then the next day when people offered the alms, then the Burmese monks were chanting, and I was listening to them chanting, and I just couldn't understand the words. And suddenly I made out one phrase, Etang mingling uttamang. And I realized it's the Mangala Sutta. Okay, so that's one meaning of the word flavor. The other meaning that I have in mind is what I mentioned about the sort of the metaphors that underlie a number of words and the way these metaphors can connect together. And so that comes through, as one studies and looks into the dictionary to find out how these words are derived. And the dictionaries, like the BTS dictionary and the more recent dictionary coming out from the Pali Text Society, are very helpful in that respect, in that they'll break a word down, especially a word with its compound, a word with a prefix. They'll separate the prefix from the stem form of the verb, and sometimes they'll also relate it to words in Old English, which have the same metaphorical sense. So that's the way you get a feeling for sort of the subterranean, deep underlying interconnection of roots from which the language arises.
The basic question to me is do you think that the word of the Buddha, the teachings of the Buddha, early Buddha, the historical Buddha, really are coming through in the Pali Canon? And if so, what would you think would be, the main reason you feel that way?
Okay, since there weren't since there weren't tape recorders and video cameras, so no, I'm not saying this jokingly, but we can't know, exactly what the Buddha himself taught. But so what I do is to make in my mind what I call like a probability line,
Curve, yeah.
or a probability curve, or a line going from 100% to 0%, and 100% is pretty much off. We never have 100% certainty. Okay, let's take maybe first, we have the three Pittakas, the three collections. So I take it that the Abhidhamma Pittaka is largely a product of, well, let's say it's a collection of texts that evolved over the centuries. I think probably the oldest stratum of the Abhidhamma Pittaka would be parts of the second book, which is called the Vibhanga, in which there are treats of the main doctrinal categories of Buddhism, like the 5 aggregates, 12 sense bases, 18 elements, 4 noble truths, dependent origination, noble eightfold path, 4 foundations of mindfulness. And each of these chapters has at least 2 sections. One is called the Sutta treatment, and the other is called the Abhidhamma treatment. And what the Sutta treatment does, the Sutta section does, is to take, usually it quotes a phrase from the suttas, and then it takes each word and gives a sort of extended definition of it. So my conjecture would be that maybe that part of the Abhidhamma comes from the very old stage, maybe the earliest stage of the Abhidhamma, and then over time, the different generations of monks expanded the sort of philosophical ways of understanding the teaching, the methods of psychological analysis of the factors, the psychological and physical factors, until different systems arose. So one of these systems is the Pali system. So we could say Abhidhamma Pittaka is fairly late, relative to the other Pittakas. In the Vinaya Pittaka, I guess that the rules themselves come from the Buddha, because I can't imagine sort of monks making up rules. No, that's not intended humorously. So I would say it's likely, especially the rules that go into the Patimokkha or Pratimoksha, I think likely came from the Buddha. But the Vinaya Pittaka contains other material, like background stories, which sometimes I have to say it's pretty difficult to connect the background story to the rule. Then come word explanations of words in the rule. I would say that is probably fairly early. And then come, especially with the more important rules, various permutations, approximations, variations on transgressions of the rules. I would say perhaps that evolved over a certain period as different types of transgressions arose, and the monks specializing in the Vinaya had to determine, is this really a full offense, a partial offense, or no offense? So that's just conjecture. So taking what seem to be the oldest parts of the Pali Canon, these parts of the Sutta Pittaka, particularly I would take the fundamental suttas of the Majjhima Nikaya and the basic primary chapters of the Samyutta Nikaya, and certainly certain portions of the Anguttara Nikaya. I say that those are very old, and I say that there's a very high probability that the ideas in them come from the Buddha himself. But I would suspect that, you see, because I would say that after the Buddha passed away, the monks who were taking the responsibility for creating a collection of his teachings, if we take all of the variations in speech that the Buddha would have used, the natural variations of speech in expressing ideas, it would just have been too much material. It's likely that they streamlined the material and standardized the formulation, and also used a fair amount of repetition because the texts were being transmitted orally. And so through repetition, when you have to repeat, a sequence of events, it gets impressed on the mind. So we get again and again, for example, then a certain Brahmin approached the Blessed One. Having approached, he exchanged greetings with the Blessed One. Having exchanged greetings with the Blessed One, he sat down to one side. Sitting to one side, that Brahmin said this to the Blessed One.
Right.
If you just say, well, sometimes I like abridge passages like that by saying, then a certain Brahmin approached the Blessed One, greeted him, sat down to one side and said. But when you have to repeat it, then it gets impressed on the mind. And this is done not for little phrases like that, but sometimes, like almost like whole paragraphs or long sentences are repeated. So I say that there's probably a certain amount of editing which would have gone into streamlining the original teachings, standardizing the formulations, and expanding the number of repetitions to aid memorization. Okay, Ben?
But I know that you have been translating a lot of Pali in a Tibetan to English, and I'm also working out on certain translation. I'm working out on the challenges in translating Buddhist Pali terms into English.
Yeah.
So would you like to say something about how this term dukkha can be translated into English?
Yeah. Yeah. From early times, translators have been using the word suffering. And if we take it to be very literal, it's not really correct. Though I use suffering myself because to get the real meaning of dukkha, you have to give an explanation, not a word-for-word translation. And if you bring in if you use an explanation, then the teaching doesn't have sufficient punch. Because sometimes like we explain the word dukkha as having this, when I explain it like in a lecture or discourse, I say, okay, the word dukkha, we have to understand it's not really literally suffering, but it's the sense of unsatisfactoriness, deficiency, inadequacy, the flawed nature of phenomena. And people are sitting, what's he talking about? Here I have a delicious ice cream smoothie, and he's speaking about deficiency and inadequacy and unsatisfactoriness.
Yeah, exactly.
So when you use the word, people are always, or at least when they're being honest with themselves, they're thinking, things are not quite right with my life. I'm not really satisfied with myself. Or I'm getting into so much trouble these days. So when you use the word suffering, then they think, wow, this teaching is really about my problem. So then their interest gets aroused and they get drawn to the teaching. But then if you get statements like the 5 aggregates are dukkha, like the Buddha says, then it doesn't mean that, this, well, of course the physical body can be suffering, but it doesn't mean that when the Buddha says all feeling is dukkha, he doesn't mean that that from the moment I wake up in the morning till the moment I fall asleep at night, I'm experiencing nothing but pain and misery and grief and sorrow. So dukkha here has a sort of deeper sense of, again, what I mean, what I'm trying to get at with the word like unsatisfactory, deficient, inadequate, defective. And so the Buddha then he'll explain that painful feeling is dukkha because it is really suffering, whereas pleasant feeling is dukkha because it doesn't last. Well, what does he say? A pleasant feeling. He says painful feeling is dukkha because it's like an arrow. Pleasant feeling is dukkha because it doesn't last.
Doesn't last, it's willed or takes effort.
And then neutral feeling is dukkha in the sense that it's a conditioned phenomena. And so, you know, we have these different levels or layers of meaning of the word dukkha. And so, again, for translation purposes, it may be useful to use the word suffering for dukkha. But we have to prevent explanation. We have to prevent misunderstanding by giving some explanation of what the Buddha really means by the word dukkha. Of course, if somebody comes up with a more satisfactory alternative to suffering, then we might adopt that. But, you know, it's like one translator, Venerable Panisaro, he uses stress a lot.
Yeah.
But again, stress is also problematic because, you know, when I'm in a state of relaxed pleasure, I'm not feeling stress, but still, that's also considered dukkha. And dukkha can be translated as pain with reference to actual feeling. So there's dukkha vedana, that is painful feeling, in contrast to sukha vedana, pleasant feeling.
I remember when Dr. Vankula Rahula, in his book, he says, it's really misleading, people are trying to give so many different interpretations to dukkha in English, and it then leads to so many other avenues. So
It leads to what?
he says like, we are really being misdirected, kind of. And so he finally suggests it's better to remain dukkha, without being translated.
Yeah, but I think, you know, if one is writing or translating for new readers to Buddhism, well, my principle is to try to keep words that are not translated to a minimum. And if we don't translate dukkha, then somebody has to look for an explanation. It's difficult for them to get a grip on the teaching. So as a kind of upaya or skillful means, I would translate dukkha as suffering. But again, we have to qualify it through explanation.
Dukkha word itself is made of two words.
Yeah.
Du and ka. So ka is kind of whole, right? Whole. How can we explain?
I think that's the way the commentaries explain it, but I'm not so sure that it's intended in that way as
Bad
in the sense of an empty hole. I think my sense is that ka just has the sense of a state, and the prefix dur is always used in the sense of something which is bad. Like dukkata is something badly done, or we have duranu bodha, difficult to understand.
And I also found another word, daurya manishya. Daurya manishya is kind of a lack of confidence.
Say again?
Lack of confidence.
No, not the English.
Daurya manishya.
Sanskrit?
Sanskrit.
Yeah.
Daurya is kind of inferiority complex. Inferiority complex.
Daurya
Daurya
manishya.
manishya.
Yeah, I hear the word, I'm trying to picture it. You don't mean the Pali domanassa?
Yeah, I do.
That's the Sanskrit Tao?
Daurya manishya.
Yeah, Tao.
It's very close.
Yeah, actually, the Pali domanassa is actually.
Dichotomy.
Yeah, it comes, in this way it comes in Pali. And I think the Sanskrit is
Dao. D-O.
Dao
Yes.
Man with this.
Sure.
Is that
So yeah, Y-A, R-Y-A,
Dao
R-Y-A. No, in the middle.
RYA?
Before M.
RYA for the end.
Before M.
Before-
R-Y-A.
D-A-U-R-Y-A.
Okay, DAUR.
Y-A.
Why?
Oh, I see.
The audio marks.
Okay, okay. Yeah, so this is derived from, okay, we have the word mano, or actually the stem form would be manas, meaning mind. And then here we have the prefix dur. This is the Pali form, dur, which again has the sense of something bad, which is undesirable. So from this we get an adjective in Pali, dumina, which means something like sad or sorrowful or dejected. And then from this we get, in Pali, the noun domanassa. And then I guess in Sanskrit it would probably be, well, the adjective would probably be daumana, and then to turn it into the noun, then it becomes daurya manasya, right? Okay.
I have a question in terms of Pali commentaries.
Yeah.
Okay. So you discuss much about Pali canon, but I think there is conversation that is going on. That was going on when I was in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
So after moving to USA, I heard this one. So Pali commentators or Abhidhamma, both we consider as you said, later development.
Yeah, yeah.
So some educated people or scholars say
Yeah.
that commentators have distorted or changed
Yeah.
Pali Buddhism, what the Buddha originally taught.
Yeah.
So sometimes, particularly the Visuddhi marker.
Yeah.
So how do you define these different?
Yeah, I don't want to say that the commentaries distort the Buddha's teachings, but to say what's taking place, the Pali Nikayas, the teachings of the Pali Nikayas, we could say are not, this might seem a little controversial to some monks, but they're not uniquely Theravada teachings, but these are this is the common foundational stratum of teachings of early Buddhism. So we find, if we take the Chinese, the Agamas translated into Chinese, basically the teachings are very much the same, even though the suttas might be formulated differently in this collection, that collection. So this is like the base, foundational fountainhead of teaching. And now, as time went on, different groups of, especially of monks living in different geographical regions, would have inherited basically the same collection of texts. But then, especially as they explored the text, through their discussions, and then in the form of philosophical texts, Abhidharma texts, they came to look at the text in somewhat different ways. And then each school formulated more precise, systematic ways of treating the teachings. And so the particular method of treating, analyzing, connecting, interpreting the teachings that then became distinctive of a particular school, which we now call Theravada Buddhism, those would be the commentaries that would have evolved over the older commentaries would have evolved over several centuries, maybe even the original level, the oldest level, maybe going back to the direct disciples of the Buddha, who would have given more elaborate explanations of terms, then passing from generation to generation, with each generation, or at least over each century, adding more material, till it seems that the old Pali commentaries that don't exist anymore were closed maybe the 1st century of AD, or of the Common Era. What's it called now? CE. The 1st century CE in Sri Lanka, in the old Ceylon. And then Buddhaghosa would have taken those old commentaries that were preserved in the Mahavihara.
Hilatua.
Yeah, they weren't preserved in the Pali language, but they had been preserved in the old form of the Sinhala language, which is called Ahela.
Hilatua.
Yeah.
Sihalatta Kata.
Yeah. There were various Attakatas. The main one was called the Sihala Attakata or the Maha Attakata. And then he took what he considered to be like the most important explanations and then translated them into Pali. Not the original teaching of the Buddha himself, but a kind of systematic version of the teaching as it's passed on through several centuries, 4 or 5 centuries, in the school that we now call the Theravada school, or the Mahavihara school. And so the teaching is like more intricate, more systematic, and there are like new interpretative concepts are introduced in order to weave together different strands from the early discourses. Because the Buddha himself didn't establish like a system. He didn't give like one long discourse going on for, he didn't call he said,
3 weeks.
I'm going to have a 2-week retreat in which I'm just going to lay down the whole system. So send the word out to all of Magadha and Kosala and get everybody here. But rather the Buddha just traveled around, and when he met different groups of people, he would give discourses that he felt were appropriate to them. And so there were like consistent themes and consistent structures in the Buddha's teaching, like again and again, 4 Noble Truths, 12 links of dependent origination, 5 hindrances. And so these would be repeated themes, but the way the Buddha expressed himself would depend on the people that he's teaching. And so probably, later generations, people would be thinking, especially in the monasteries, how do we take this material and connect it all together into some form of some embracing system in which we could fit everything. And so different schools would have worked out different methods of interpretation, and we probably lost all of the commentaries from the older school, from the other schools, like Savastivada, Mahasangika, Dharmakuptaka. But fortunately, the commentaries that had been preserved in Sri Lanka then were translated into Pali and have now come down to the present day.
Yeah. Do you think that without Pali commentaries or commentators' work,
Yeah.
so can we understand their Buddhism? Or some scholars say early canonical texts are enough. Do you think so?
I'd say we always have to give primacy to the early texts. And what has happened, I have to say, especially in Sri Lanka, also in Burma, is that there's a tendency to give primacy to the commentaries and the Suttimagga. So whenever monks have to preach the Dhamma, what they do is to take the commentarial systematization of the teaching and use that, rather than go to the Buddha word itself. So I say give primacy to the word of the Buddha, and often one discourse by the Buddha or some other discourse will illuminate let's put it this way. In one sutta, one might find a brief statement, and so that statement might not be so clear on its own, but another discourse will take that statement and then elaborate it, explain it in greater detail. And so whenever we could interpret a statement in a sutta in terms of other suttas, give primacy to the suttas themselves. And sometimes it's difficult to understand. In that case, I say it's useful to look at the commentary, but always remember that the commentary is representing the interpretations that have built up over 4, 5, 6 centuries and represent the scheme of understanding in a particular school, especially which is trying to look at the discourses through, particularly through concepts coming either from the Abhidhamma or from early generations of teachers. But sometimes I have to say the commentaries are extremely useful, particularly in distinguishing different meanings of a particular word. Like the example that I usually choose to illustrate this, I know I'm past my hour.
Oh,
Do you guys have classes now?
We're totally upset that you're running late.
I don't want to hold people back from class.
Oh my gosh, this is awful.
Okay, there's a word, very fundamental word of the Buddha's teaching. Oops. Bahana, which means abandoning or elimination. And we find this word bahana being used sometimes in relation to conduct, sometimes in relation to the development of samadhi, and sometimes in relation to the achievement of the stages of Aryan noble realization. And so if we just look at the suttas, we see this word used in different contexts. And so, it might be difficult to distinguish exactly what's meant by this word. And now, like the commentary will take the word bahana and say that distinguish 3 kinds of bahana. Sometimes they even have 4 and 5, but to keep it simple, they distinguish something called tad anga bahana. Then so they distinguish like 3 meanings of bahana. So tadanga bahana means abandoning in a particular respect. And so this can be understood in different ways, but okay, say one takes the precept to abstain from taking life, then one is abandoning the tendency to kill living beings in a particular respect because of taking the precept. Okay, but then we have the kambana bahana, which means abandoning through suppression. And this is used in relation to the development of samadhi, particularly the jhanas, so that to enter samadhi, one has to abandon the 5 hindrances. And so when the text speaks about abandoning the 5 hindrances, then the commentary will say, this is the kambana bahana, which means abandoning by suppression. It means by choosing a meditation object and learning to focus the mind on that object to the point that one becomes absorbed in the object, then one abandons the hindrances or the defilements, but it's not the ultimate elimination of them. But then you'll come across a passage which speaks about a meditator who abandons like the 3 fetters, the lower fetters, like view of self, doubt, attachment to rites and rituals. So then the commentary will say, that is samucheda bahana. This means abandoning by eradication, by cutting off. Yeah, so this is just like one example how the commentary is useful in indicating different meanings of a single word. Okay, I think maybe we
Wonderful, thank you so much.
Well, according to the Pali tradition, the tradition of appreciation is not the clapping. It is of course the Western tradition.
Yeah.
I would suggest you all to put your palms together and say 3 times Sadhu, Sadhu, Sadhu. And as this is the Pali Society, I hope
Yeah.
that makes some sense.
Yeah.
Well, UWest Pali Society also is aimed at bridging the East and the West. So I hope by using Pali in this university, we can do something together. You know, using a lot of people, we have a lot of resources here, and whenever we get some kind of resource persons, of course, we always welcome to our society, and we will give you more chances. I hope you have so many questions, of course, but time certainly flies. We have to stop here for today, and we, on behalf of the UWest Pali Society, would like to conclude this session right now. And I have an announcement for the benefit of all of you, and we are going to upload this record to our UWest YouTube so that everyone can share it.
But I might have made mistakes.
We'll blur the screen a little bit right there, you know, we'll just go and blur it a little bit.
Yeah, these are useful, but some of these things like this, I could have been. Anyway, I did say that I could be wrong here. So I gave a sufficient
Yeah,
qualification.
thank you so much
And I-
for sharing your thoughts,
Yeah, yeah.
very valuable, in fact invaluable. We were all benefited, and hopefully in the future also. We hope you will be here for some time with us, and many people will be benefited in the cause. And now, on behalf of the UWest Pali Society, I would like to invite Mr. Arun Sida to deliver the word.
On behalf of Pali Society and students of University of the West, we would like to say thank you very much for your loving kindness and compassion to be here today to deliver the wisdom to us, all of us, and we really appreciate this. And as a traditional, at this moment, I would like to invite Venerable to offering the role as a representative of our honors for you to be here and offering the for your compassion, actually.
Okay,
Sadhu.